Bill Burnett and Dave Evans, who built and taught the life design course at Stanford, this book grew out of, open with a story about a student determined to become an astronaut. He had built his entire academic path around it. Every class, every extracurricular, every summer internship pointed at that single outcome. There was only one problem. He was already past the age NASA would consider for the astronaut program, a fact no amount of effort, planning, or persistence was going to change. Burnett and Evans call this a gravity problem, a circumstance that behaves like gravity itself, a fixed constraint you cannot solve, negotiate with, or work around no matter how much energy you throw at it. Their specific argument is that a significant share of the frustration people carry about their lives comes not from failing to solve a real problem, but from repeatedly attempting to solve a problem that was never actually solvable in the form they had framed it, while ignoring the genuinely workable version of the same underlying desire sitting right next to it. This distinction sits at the center of their broader argument, borrowed directly from the design profession they both spent careers in before turning to teaching. Life, in their framing, is not a problem to be solved once through sufficient planning and analysis. It is something closer to a design problem, open-ended, full of constraints that shift as you learn more, and best approached the way a good designer approaches any genuinely uncertain project, through iteration, prototyping, and a willingness to learn by building small, low-stakes versions of an idea before committing fully to any single path. In this video, I want to walk through the specific tools this book offers for applying that design mindset to an actual life, what each one requires in practice, and where, honestly, the corporate design thinking framework this book borrows from runs into real limits once applied to something as personal and constrained as an actual human life. Stay with me. Wayfinding without a map. Burnett and Evans open with a reframe of the common advice to find your passion, which they argue is built on a shaky premise. Research on how people actually develop deep interests, they note, tends to show that most people do not arrive with one true calling waiting to be discovered. Interests develop gradually, often after exposure and competence, not before it, which means waiting to feel a clear, singular passion before committing to any direction frequently produces years of paralysis rather than clarity. Their alternative is what they call wayfinding, navigating by paying close attention to markers of engagement and energy in your current activities rather than by a fixed destination decided in advance. The specific practice involves tracking in detail which activities genuinely engage you and leave you energized, and which ones drain you regardless of how prestigious or sensible they look on paper, treating this accumulated pattern as the actual, reliable compass, considerably more trustworthy than a single, dramatic moment of clarity that may never arrive on schedule. They recommend a specific tool for this tracking, a simple daily log, noting engagement and energy levels across the activities that filled the day, reviewed periodically for patterns rather than judged moment to moment. The value, they argue, comes specifically from the accumulation, since any single day's log tells you very little, while weeks of consistent tracking begin to reveal a genuinely reliable signal about which categories of work and interaction reliably produce energy and engagement, a signal considerably harder to access through introspection alone, which tends to be distorted by whatever mood or recent event happens to be most salient at the moment of reflection. Gravity problems and reframing. The astronaut story sets up the book's central diagnostic tool, distinguishing genuinely solvable problems from gravity problems that only look solvable because they have been framed incorrectly. Burnett and Evans argue that a substantial amount of chronic dissatisfaction comes from investing energy into gravity problems, fixed circumstances mistaken for actionable ones, while the actual, workable version of the underlying desire goes unexamined. The specific technique they offer is reframing, deliberately restating a stuck problem in several different ways until a genuinely actionable version emerges. The aspiring astronaut, in their example, was not actually attached to the specific job title. He was drawn to exploration, to the frontier of human capability, to being part of something at the edge of what is currently possible, all of which remained genuinely available to him through other paths entirely, once the problem was reframed away from the one specific, foreclosed job title he had been fixated on. They are specific about the discipline this requires, since the first reframe attempted is often still too close to the original, unsolvable version to actually help. Effective reframing, in their account, usually takes several genuine attempts, each one pulling further away from the specific surface-level form the original problem took, before an underlying version emerges that is both true to the original desire and actually workable given the real constraints involved. The Odyssey Plan. One of the book's signature exercises asks readers to sketch 3 distinct 5-year plans for their life, not sequential alternatives, but genuinely parallel possibilities. The first is a continuation of the current path. The second explores what would happen if that current path became unavailable entirely, a deliberate exercise in imagining a real, workable alternative rather than treating the current direction as the only viable option. The third, deliberately unconstrained by money, image, or the opinions of others, asks what you would build if none of those usual limiting factors applied. The specific value Burnett and Evans claim for this exercise is not that any one of the 3 plans should be adopted wholesale. It is that most people, when asked to imagine their life in only one way, tend to treat that single imagined version as the only real option, foreclosing genuine exploration before it starts. Generating 3 genuinely different, plausible versions forces a kind of imaginative range most people never otherwise access, frequently surfacing elements worth pursuing that the single default version had never made visible at all. They pair the exercise with a specific evaluative step, rating each of the 3 plans across several dimensions, including resources required, how much it engages your genuine interests, confidence that it could actually be pursued, and coherence with your broader sense of who you are. The resulting comparison, they argue, is less about identifying a single winning plan than about noticing which specific elements recur or stand out favorably across all 3, elements that frequently turn out to be worth pursuing regardless of which overall path is eventually chosen. Prototyping instead of deciding. Rather than treating a major life decision as a single, high-stakes choice to be made correctly through exhaustive analysis, Burnett and Evans recommend prototyping, building small, low-risk experiments that generate real information about a possible direction before any large, irreversible commitment is made. The specific technique they emphasize most is the life design interview, a structured, low-pressure conversation with someone already doing the kind of work or living the kind of life under consideration, focused not on asking for a job, but on genuinely understanding what the day-to-day experience actually involves, information that is, in their experience, considerably more accurate and more useful than anything available through research or imagination alone. They pair this with smaller-scale trial experiences, a volunteer project, a short course, a side project conducted alongside an existing job, treating each as a genuine data-gathering exercise rather than a binary test of whether the whole direction is correct. They are specific about why the framing of these interviews as information gathering rather than job-seeking matters. A conversation explicitly framed around what someone's actual day looks like tends to produce considerably more honest, detailed answers than a conversation the other person perceives as an implicit request for a favor or a position, since the second framing tends to trigger a more guarded, polished version of the answer, rather than the genuinely useful, unvarnished account the exercise is actually after. Choosing well without overthinking. The book addresses a specific trap they observe frequently among capable, analytical people, treating every major decision as though it demands exhaustive analysis of every option before any choice can be responsibly made. Burnett and Evans argue this approach, counterintuitively, tends to produce worse decisions, not better ones, because decision quality actually declines past a certain point of analysis, as diminishing returns on additional information get overwhelmed by the anxiety and second-guessing that prolonged deliberation generates. Their specific recommendation is choosing well rather than choosing perfectly, narrowing to a reasonable, well-considered set of options, making a genuine choice among them, and then deliberately not continuing to relitigate the decision indefinitely afterward. They pair this with a specific practice they call letting go, treating a made decision as provisionally final, freeing the energy that would otherwise go into ongoing second-guessing and redirecting it toward actually making the chosen path work, which they argue matters more to eventual satisfaction than whether the objectively optimal option was technically selected in the first place. They connect this directly back to their wayfinding framework, arguing that a decision made through the process described earlier, gathering real information through prototyping and life design interviews rather than abstract speculation, deserves genuine confidence once made, precisely because it was built on something more solid than guesswork. The anxious over-analysis they are warning against tends to show up most acutely, in their observation, among people who skip the earlier prototyping stage entirely and are instead trying to resolve genuine uncertainty through pure deliberation alone. A task deliberation was never actually well suited to accomplish on its own. Now let us be honest about this book. The design thinking framework Burnett and Evans bring from their careers in product design and engineering gives the book a genuinely useful structure, and tools like the Odyssey Plan and the Life Design Interview are concrete, actionable, and considerably more specific than the vague encouragement to follow your passion that much of the surrounding genre still relies on. There is a fair critique worth engaging directly regarding how cleanly a methodology built for designing physical products and digital experiences actually transfers onto something as personal, relational, and constrained as an actual human life. Product design assumes a designer with genuine authority over the constraints of the project, free to prototype, iterate, and redirect resources relatively freely. A human life carries constraints, financial obligations, caregiving responsibilities, health conditions, structural barriers tied to circumstance rather than mindset that are considerably less negotiable than anything a product designer typically contends with, and the book's generally optimistic, exploration-friendly tone does not always fully register how differently its tools apply to a reader working with meaningfully less slack in their circumstances than the Stanford students the course was originally designed for. There is also a specific tension worth namming inside the gravity problem concept itself. Distinguishing a genuinely fixed constraint from a problem that only looks fixed is a genuinely useful skill, but the book offers relatively little guidance for the harder, more ambiguous cases in between, circumstances that are not literally impossible to change, but that would require resources, time, or collective action well beyond what individual reframing alone can supply. Treating every apparent obstacle as either purely a gravity problem or purely a reframing opportunity risks flattening a considerably messier reality, where some constraints are genuinely worth continuing to push against, even slowly, rather than accepted and redirected around entirely. None of this undermines the book's real, practical value. The core shift, treating life direction as something learned iteratively through small, real experiments rather than decided once through exhaustive upfront analysis, is a genuinely useful corrective to the far more common approach of either drifting indefinitely or overplanning a single, untested path. So what do you actually take from this? The most immediately useful tool is the reframing exercise applied to your own current sources of frustration. Take whatever feels stuck right now and restate it several different ways, specifically asking which version of the underlying desire might actually be workable, rather than continuing to invest energy into a version of the problem that was never genuinely solvable in the first place. The second useful idea is treating uncertainty about direction as a normal, expected condition to be navigated through small experiments, rather than a failure of planning to be resolved entirely before taking any action. A short conversation or a small trial project generates real, usable information considerably faster than months of abstract deliberation ever will. The third thing is simply this. A decision does not need to be objectively optimal to be genuinely good, and the energy spent relentlessly second-guessing an already reasonable choice is very often better spent making that choice actually work, which tends to matter far more to how a life ultimately feels than whether the theoretically best possible option was technically selected at the outset. Thanks for watching all the way through. Some walls really are gravity. Most of the ones people spend years pushing against are not.